everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Ask Me Anything, which is kind of different for a webinar because normally a webinar is we're just going to share a lot of information. In this case, we are going to let you ask us anything. And to frame this, I want to kind of recap where we've been and where we're going. On the line with me, I have James McElroy, who is in the design lead and design program at CVS. I've got Lys Maitland, who's in UX research and UX design at CVS. And I've got Cartwright, whose title is extremely elusive to figure out because she seems to be doing lots of things everywhere. And I admire that because Catherine's, I think, an embodiment of the kind of people who add positive energy into systems that need it. And so she's just an energy generator, and I'm just going to be excited about that. My name is Luke Hohmann. I'm a SAFE fellow. I'm the Chief Innovation Officer at Applied Frameworks, and I am delighted to share that I got to work with all of these wonderful people in the topic that we're going to talk about. In our first webinar, James gave us a really interesting and very powerful, I think, personal history of his relationship with SAFE. And by closure, Catherine and Lys's and myself and many of our relationships with SAFE. When I got involved with SAFE, it really didn't have customer centricity and design thinking as a prominent part of the framework. And I was among the people who on the framework team worked to bring that forward. But we have more work to do. And the CVS team really helped advance this. Where we ended up in that first webinar was we kind of got a little rushed in our detailed exploration of how CVS really did extend the framework and integrate design thinking and design practices into SAFE along with designers. And that's an important point. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take about 10 minutes to start with the approach of CVS that James had outlined. Let James kind of put a little bit more effort into that and let you reset your own mind about where were we with CVS. And then we'll have about 40 to 45 minutes to do an Ask Us Anything. And we mean that. You could ask me about how to make a proper margarita. I have a YouTube video on that. You could also ask me about things about Agile and SAFE. I might know something there too. You can ask Catherine and about implementation of trains and large-scale integrations and some of the finer details. And she might even have some bonus content that we may leverage. And of course, you can ask Lys and James about design. So with that, James, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Or if you wanted to share your screen, I was going to say, let's pick up with our approach. And when you want me to advance, just say next, and I'll go ahead and advance.
Sounds good. So hello, everyone. So this slide was really kind of explaining that what we've done over the last several years is really, I would describe it as just kind of a slight extension of what SAFE has already been saying. And I think one of the things that Lys, Catherine, and I found is, while many people, when you look at SAFE at first glance, the design is kind of hard to find, so to speak. The more we looked at this, we kind of realized it's actually there. It's just maybe not as apparent as we all might think. And so if you've gone through SAFE training, there's an entire article about intentional architecture. And it's really just the way I would describe that is it's setting the case, making the case for something that often doesn't exist in Agile, which is the idea of doing things that is not just cranking out code every minute of the day. I think it's very easy to misunderstand Agile to be, if it's not code, it's not moving the ship forward, the train forward, I guess. And so we kind of use that as our foundation point. And intentional architecture is actually something we started talking about after we got questions about it. And Catherine, I'm guessing we had some architects in our training that we were asked about that early on. I don't think I've ever been asked about that intentional architecture again. So it may have been that we had some ringers in our early audiences that were pushing us to get into that topic. Because I do find that sometimes people's eyes kind of glaze over when we talk about that. But if we move forward from that, architecture is embedded into SAFE. There's entire training courses in SAFE about architecture. And really this middle column was kind of our stand here, which is say, hey, look, design is also a form of architecture. Just instead of architecting code, we're architecting experiences. And for many companies, ourselves included, that's not just software experiences, it's in-store experiences, it's call center experiences, it's, increasingly it's chatbot and other forms of, AI-based technology. And then the third piece is kind of just our pitch in a sense, which is to say, SAFe already has these principles. They've been there all along. They tend to be written in terms of software, and we've just kind of explained without adding new principles to SAFe and just really clarifying the existing ones. Design actually has a really good home in SAFe, and designers specifically. So that's kind of the approach that we took here. Lys or Catherine, I don't know if you'd want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's great. Just to add that, we're also aware of, Joe Montalbano's work, the human-centered agile, and Brad Lehman, and they call it the research runway. So we think of very much using that in parallel, the design and research runway as well, or with the idea of emergence as well as intentional design.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. Like many design teams we've talked to outside of CVS have come up with very similar conclusions. So it's not like we've come up with this miraculous invention here that came out of thin air. It's really if you follow the principles, it's emergent, right? It actually kind of is like, oh wow, this totally makes sense. And then this is really where we put that into practice. So architectural runway, and again, this is directly out of SAFe articles. It's formatted a little bit easier to kind of see here. And SAFe defines architectural runway in this way. And so we obviously are often looking for near-term features. Like I'm dealing with this right now. People are always eager to get features out the door, right? That's ultimately how you deliver things to your customers. But the idea of the architectural runway is that you need to invest in the future for near-term features to be able to get produced without redesign and delay is how SAFe terms it. And so the architectural runway, as it's traditionally been defined in SAFe, is code, components, and technical infrastructure. And the reason we invest in this runway is to have that foundation. And the foundation you're building that runway for business initiatives or for new features and capabilities. And so in the next slide, what we just ended up doing here is saying, yes, we agree with this. This is typically a kind of a more software-based point of view. And we're not saying that's wrong. We're just saying that there's other aspects to this. And so in the next slide, what we show here is if you clarify this and you just extend this, this applies to design or UX, which is where Lisa and I live, and Catherine is one of our greatest supporters. And so the code, components, and technical infrastructure, yes, if you're a software architect, that is the kind of thing you're building in Runway. As designers at CVS, the things we're building with Runway are discovery insights. And discovery is really about understanding what problem you have, what users, customers have that problem. User research findings. And so Lisa's team has an amazing repertoire of activities that they can do to help us uncover various aspects of what our customers are trying to do. And then design deliverables are really the things, this is mock-ups, right? So if you're a UX designer, UI designer, this is the stuff that typically we're known for. It's the thing that people outside of design often think it's the only thing we do is draw pictures, essentially. And part of our point, if you're a designer, is to explain, yes, we do draw pictures. That's part of our job, just like an architect draws a blueprint of a building. But just like an architect in a building, there's a lot of work that happens before you ever put pen to paper to design that ultimate experience. And so that's the kind of thing we're doing. And then uses of enablers is, again, this is the SAFe definition. So if we click through this, it kind of shows software review has this. And our clarification here is that in addition to infrastructure, it's like infrastructure for software might be, your code repos. It might be getting various technologies into place to make it easier to share code. On our side, we're doing things like discovering those needs, validating hypotheses. One of the things I think Lys, Catherine, and I have talked about a lot with SAFe that we love is the emphasis on validating hypotheses. It's acknowledging that we're making educated guesses. And so we try to structure our design activities based on this hypothesis. If we build this feature, this user experience addition to this product, what behavior will we see as a result? And if we can't answer that question, it really suggests we're not ready to try a new feature because we're not sure what we're trying to get out of it. So yeah, that's kind of how we're doing that. And then SAFE gave us these enablers already. And so what we just said is, okay, let's drill down into exploration enablers. They really describe what we do in design already. And we have adapted exploration enablers because what we found is that discovery and design are two different design activities, and they're both critical. But we found our development and product partners often got confused if we were carving out an enabler, which is a chunk of time in SAFE, right, in a sprint. They kind of magically expected us to always come up with a mock-up, no matter what we were doing. And so the reason we ended up coming up with the discovery enabler as a term was to say, hey, if we're not sure what problem we're solving, you don't actually want us to do a mock-up because we're just wasting time and money assuming that there's a problem to be solved here. Let's instead spend that time and talk to our customers, understand what problem do they really have. We may conclude that, you know what, there's nothing for us to do here, let's move on. Or maybe the problem they have is a totally different one than we originally thought. So that was kind of why we did the two. And this is how we describe the difference. So discovery is all about understanding the problem. Design is all about how are we going to solve the problem. We mentioned this last time, but to really reemphasize this, we're not saying you have to rediscover every time you do design work. There's many things that our teams work on. We have a painfully clear understanding of the challenge we're trying to solve, right? It could be a problem that existed for years and years in healthcare or elsewhere. We're just saying if we're not sure, a little time spent there saves a lot of time and money in the long run because we're not chasing solutions and we don't understand the problem. And so that's kind of how we define those. And then business features, of course, what we found in our environment is everything was kind of a feature early on. Enablers was kind of like, yeah, I read about that stuff, but features are where it's at. Like we got to crank out code. And so we kind of put this slide together to say, yes, ultimately we're doing business features as well. We're partnering with our dev teams to get code out the door into our customers' hands. This is how those three things fit together. And so from a design perspective specifically, we're still doing some design work at the business feature stage, but it tends to be really fine-tuning the details. And so if you're coming at this from a design point of view, we would say the majority, I don't know, 80% plus or minus of design work is happening in discovery and design enablers. That mix will vary depending on what we're working on. Business feature may be all the design work if you're just tweaking a really minor piece. So it really depends on what you're trying to solve for. And then the famous double diamond. We loved that SAFE adopted the double diamond. We actually went back and looked at the original research, which is fascinating. If you haven't seen it from the UX Council, I think Luke inspired me to do this because Luke's always going back to the original source for material. And we went back to the original source because we found this is very often misunderstood in the design world. You have triple diamonds, quadruple diamonds, diamonds with arrows and loops and everything. And it occurred to us that maybe people don't understand what this was meant to be. And if you go back to the source, all the double diamond is really meant to be is a generic description of how design works across the world at any company in any domain, hardware, software, et cetera. And I think when we started to look at it in that lens, it's not meant to be a prescriptive, definitive, every single thing you do in design. It's really meant to be, hey, if you're trying to explain design to someone who doesn't understand it, this is a kind of good way to do it. And so that's what we use this for. Say, okay, let's not reinvent the double diamond and add diamonds and circles and squares as we've seen other places do. We just simply mapped those three concepts we had into the double diamond. So discovery enabler is roughly speaking, understanding the problem. Design is roughly speaking, developing. Develop can be confusing in the design sense because that often implies code. But development in this sense is really meaning you're developing the design, you're developing the solution, you're exploring many different ways to do it. And then deliver for us, the bulk of coding, if you think about this from a software perspective, typically happens in the business feature phase. We had
jump in on this too, because one of the inspirations for the double diamond was going back all the way to Poyla's famous book, How to Solve It, which was originally about math, but about problem solving in general. And the double diamond also is very aligned with cognitive psychology and Carl Weick's perspective of sense making. So the double diamond, to your point, which I'm glad you brought up, the deeper roots are grounded in just human psychology and human cognition and human problem solving. And what we find is that, as you said, when people had 3 or 4 or 5 diamonds, they're actually starting to hide behind the power of the simple structure. And you see the hexagons and the flows and the circles and the et ceteras But there's also, I think, a linearity to this process that is actually quite important for people to realize, is that the double diamond can be applied many times, but it's still a linear process in terms of our rigor. And yeah, of course, there's going to be some swirling back and forth as I'm engaged in developing the solution. I might find I have to go back and do a little bit more discovery. But the reality is that we want to have this progression. So for everyone who's listening, if you have a question about the double diamond or that background, again, feel free to ask it, because this is kind of one of those foundational structures within SAFE, and we did want to honor the original writing and the original work on the double diamond when we were working with SAFE.
Yeah, and then the other thing we've had a lot of discussion about internally is this whole sense of timing of enablers. And it was really interesting when we first started getting into these conversations. A lot of the pushback we got is, well, you're just going back to waterfall. You're saying I have to do this before I do this. And we tried to really change that on its head. Say, well, you don't have to do it that way. Like, you can jump to a solution and plan out your entire dev work before you understand what the problem is. And if you want to do that, sure, go ahead. But so I think it was really interesting to try to, rather than defend this, say, look, it's your business. You can do whatever you want to do. Just realize that if you're making all these assumptions, you're potentially throwing away a lot of time and money by doing a plan that you're going to throw out when you realize, you know what, we don't need to go after that problem at all. And so that's kind of the idea here. And it's really based on risk, right? Sometimes the risk is very low and you might want to plan out far in advance. Sometimes the risk is high and it might make sense not to do that. So. And then this is our inspired by Luke, I will say, about where designers sit in SAFE. This will be different for every company. And actually, this is different. When we presented this in the summer, it's not quite the same now, right? Organizations evolve. And so if I was to draw this again with Lys, we would probably do it a little bit differently. But the gist of this remains the same, which is, at our scale, and this is where SAFE really excels in my experience, is scaling to large organizations. Really, all we did here is say, okay, how do we partner with our product dev and architecture folks to help them throughout the SAFE journey? And so again, the names here can be different, but the idea is that if you have a solution architect or an enterprise architect up at the top here, we want to have someone for them to talk to from our org, and it's going to be a different person than a designer on a team. But we're all linked together. We have a shared design team. And so there's that continuity. And then these are the things that we found worked for us. And again, your mileage may vary, but what I think many of these are pretty universal. Partnering with product and architecture, no matter what flavor of Agile you talk about, this is such a critical part, right? Like, the whole idea is collaboration and working together, that our enablers are aligned to theirs. The hypothesis and benefit hypothesis statements, I feel like this comes straight out of, it's a big part of the Lean UX book. It's a big part of what's built into SAFE. It's one of my favorite parts. It's helping us remember that we're making educated guesses, and let's test those guesses before we spend a lot of time and money on them. We talk about using enablers to reduce risk, and the whole idea that we talked about last time is learning fast. There's things we can do to learn that don't require us to get code out to market. There's things you do need to get to market to learn, but there's a lot of stuff you don't need to get that far. Multiple time horizons is a really important part of design, ranging from a text fix that we could make in a few minutes to redeveloping an entire workflow for our colleagues that might take years to fully work through, and then aligning our enablers with our architecture team.
All right, let's talk about how you put it into practice, just to ground people in this, and then we'll have a good amount of time for a Q&A.
Yeah, so this is a timely example because we're back into vaccine season again. I just used this app yesterday, actually, to get my daughter vaccinated.
I just got my vaccines last week.
There you go. Yeah. So so this was a crazy project. So if you go back in time, if we had the little music and the wavy lines, if we go back in time to when COVID was around the world and there was no vaccine, the federal government had a project called Project Warp Speed with a 4-star general that was in charge of it. General Perna, and the government was getting ready to, to give huge quantities of vaccines to CVS and Walgreens and other large-scale companies that could get it out to the world as quickly as possible, or to the US as quickly as possible. And so in a way, you kind of argue like, well, this isn't safe at all. You've got, you don't have any control over this project. You're being given, essentially a deadline and other things like that. And a lot of that was true. Like we were being dictated, and other companies too. Basically, the White House was literally telling us, hey, you've got to do this by a certain date. You've got to have these features, et cetera. So it was unlike anything else we'd ever done before. But at the same time, we had these principles. They're like, well, these principles still make sense, right? And so even though COVID was a brand new vaccine, we've been giving flu shots for years, right? So it's like, well, it's not brand new. It's just a different type of vaccine, different requirements, et cetera. And we had a design team that was already doing work. And so we basically set up a discovery enabler where we started with just working with our store teams. The whole goal of vaccine schedulers, whether you're us or our competitors, is essentially to minimize the burden of your store staff, right? The store staff is generally really overburdened. There's staffing shortages. The less they can spend time doing paperwork, the more they can spend time giving people shots, which is really what they're coming to us to get. And so the service blueprinting was amazing. We sat down with people that ran our stores and literally walked through every single step, like walking into the store, like what happens when you walk into a store, where do you go, like who tells you to go to the back of the store, et cetera. And those service blueprints, again, like in a traditional agile process, we weren't doing designs. There's no design at all. We were literally just talking through the workflow. And I think in the past, we would have gotten pressure to not do that. Like, well, you guys aren't doing mockups. Why aren't you doing mockups? Go design mockups. But we had tremendously supportive leadership that understood that if we didn't understand those workflows, it didn't matter. Like, there's no point in doing those mockups. And we actually did workflows for multiple different permutations. Back then we didn't know how many shots you would get. We didn't know a number of other things. And so we had multiple versions. And what's interesting is this is exactly what the federal government did with the vaccine. It's very expensive to come up and try multiple things at the same time. Like the vaccine obviously was very expensive. And one of the reasons it went so quickly is that there's multiple bets being placed at the same time. We basically did the same thing with UX design. We took the time and money to do multiple different permutations. We normally wouldn't do that. It's generally too expensive. But in this case, it was exactly what was needed. And then as we started to get those details fleshed out, we're starting from scratch. Like, okay, the government picks path one. We'll take up that. Now we'll translate it to design. We did design enablers to create that into interactive prototypes. We actually shared that with people very high up in the government. And that prototype helped everyone understand, like, yeah, we actually have thought this through. We know how this is going to work down to the level of detail of how you sign up for the shot. And by the time we got out to the features, we had so much of this work done. And this is truly the benefit of enablers. We had basically done all of this work so that by the time we started coding, we had a much better sense and we had minimized that risk cone. And so if you go ahead, I think in the slide, it just kind of shows a screenshot from the scheduler. Oh, maybe it doesn't if it's not. Oh, I think I sent you the PDF. Sorry. In the PowerPoint, that just scrolls. And so we had really good results to that and got some great press of that. It was I think the thing to really emphasize here too is it was not the design team working in a silo. It was the design team working with engineering, working with product, with research, Lys's team. Like everyone that needed to be part of this came together, and it was an amazing project to be part of because the impact was huge.
Okay, so we're at our point where we look at some challenges, and then we'll bring it home with the Q&A. So some of the challenges that you faced were this notion of how do you communicate during things like safe rituals, the system demo, what your work is.
Yeah, and these aren't exact quotes because these go back years and years in time, but these are pretty close paraphrases, right? And the other context setting is we adopted SAFE in roughly a year across a 4,000 to 5,000 person org. And so what does that look like? Well, it means a whole bunch of people getting trained in SAFE at the same time. We probably called like every SAFE trainer that was available in a 3,000 mile radius, right? And we're doing it simultaneously. And so the challenge with that is we were having trainers that had just been trained themselves, right? And so no fault of their own, but when you've just been trained, you kind of go by the book because that's all you know. And so these were the kind of comments we kept getting from folks, and well-intentioned. We had nothing against them personally, but they were kind of saying things like, okay, if we look at what's in italics here, the system demo, it's kind of like, you have substitute teacher and they go look in the book. Well, what's the answer? Well, the answer in the book is it's a production-like environment. That sounds like code. And so we had people saying, well, the book says it's code. You can't demo stuff that's not code. And, we'd politely raise our hands like you would with a substitute maybe and say, well, actually, there's value into this. And so part of what we started to do is turn the discussion away from what the book says, literally, to what's the intent behind the book. And so with demos, we kind of explained, well, you probably want us to demo what our experience is going to look like, because that will help you answer questions before you write code. The next slide has similar objections that we had related to PI objectives. And so again, the italics is what people were kind of getting out of the book, so to speak. PI objectives are summarize the business and technical goals. It doesn't say design goals. And so again, we made a case like, well, design goals are important too. And actually one of the best things for this is our leaders started asking us, hey, can you, we had VPs of product, for example, say, can you talk about your design goals? And, when your product partner is asking, it gets, other folks say, well, I guess if the product wants to know, that must be okay. So PI objectives, that kind of goal or that conflict went away. And then I think the last one was about readouts. And again, designers can't present at readouts. And again, there's nothing in the book that says you can or can't, but it was interpreted as it doesn't make sense for us. But it was really, the more we did this, the more people wanted to hear from us. And so it was great where it was no longer us lobbying to be heard. It was our customers, our product partners saying, hey, like, they're doing some enabler stuff there. Let's hear about it. Like, what are your objectives? What do you want to talk about in the readout? So, these objectives, and then the waterfall, like waiting a PI to code will just slow us down. And the next slide is kind of our answer to this specific one. Again, like I mentioned this earlier, we said, look, you don't need to wait a PI. You can go right ahead and do it. But if you remember the deck that we talked about for this whole talk, this whole idea of risks and assumptions. And so we've really tried to explain the value of what we're doing in terms of minimizing those risks and validating those assumptions. And so it's really a way to go faster. It seems slower because you're spreading it over time, but you're able to make much more efficient decisions with your time as you do this. And so for us, these objectives, or objections, I should say, spaced out, I don't know, many, many months. And these were objections really on the CVS side. Again, Aetna had been doing SAFE long before CVS acquired them. And then this was really just how we wrapped up our summary from the talk. Designers, we believe, bring tremendous value to companies. We've been doing design for decades. Obviously, we're passionate about it. We do recommend embedding them in every aspect of SAFE. And that's kind of that picture that showed the designers around the big picture. Enablers are really just a tool to do something design has done for decades, which is to learn quickly through experimentation and iteration. Lean UX, in our experience, fits really well with the principles of SAFE, the focus on experimentation. And then just some tips if you're in an org that doesn't have a designer. We found, through firsthand experience, that you just want to make sure if you're in a big company, which is typically the case if you're following SAFE, it can be an acquired taste for designers. Some designers love the challenge of enterprise. Others do not. There's nothing wrong with that. But we've learned to get pretty good about letting people know what they're in for when you come to do design at scale. It's very unlike a startup. And then agencies, of course, agencies often are in business to get into your organization and never leave. And so what we recommend is you don't need to do that with design. There's plenty of designers out there. And there's agencies that'll help you get to that state. And I've worked with companies like that in the past.
All right. Well, the summary is that CVS and the design team were quite effective in enabling, or not enabling, I'm using the word enabling because it's on the screen and it's got me thinking about it. But they were extraordinarily effective at using the constructs and principles of SAFE to more effectively bring design in. Lys, and we've got some suggested reading. Marty Kagan, shout out to Marty. He lives in the same city I do, Sunnyvale, California, and he's a great guy. And Jeff Gottschall and Josh Eden, Lean UX. Again, shout out to another great book. But I want to. And one more reading, we'll make sure that these are available. But I want to go ahead and now I'm going to stop sharing because we're going to, instead of sharing our learnings, we're going to talk. But Lisa, I've got a shout out for you right off the bat. And one of the questions that has come up, and this is selfish because one of the people in my product management classes asked this, and you know how I love to have people in my classes like really engage. But the question was this: from the design thinking community's perspective, and it's a two-part question. What is the distinction between a service blueprint and a journey map? And do I need both?
That is actually a great question that we've been talking a lot around here. Service blueprinting is a complete discipline unto itself. It is different than journey mapping. And I'm not an expert in service blueprinting. I actually have somebody on my team who has a master's in service design. But one of the really, I can actually pull up a definition because we were trying to like make sure that we could really articulate this to our teams as well. But service blueprints allow you to really look at the front of house and back of house interactions, which journey maps are usually about the user's experience, not everything that's happening behind the stage, the systems and all of the different pieces that go into the interactions or some of the things that you might encounter outside of the journey map. So when we're looking at those differences, journey maps, we're really looking at not necessarily like the back end processes. We're looking at like, what's the experience? What are the opportunities? What are the thoughts and feelings for those people versus what is it that they're going through? What are all the touch points and what's happening behind the scenes for them as well? And I can pull up the definition that we actually just published recently and that kind of talks about the difference too.
You know, the way I described it was a little similar. And I said, in my experience, service blueprints are still in that more factual orientation, whereas the customer journey map, you really are trying to understand the emotions, the feelings, the opportunities. And the opportunities aren't, in a sense, these cold business opportunities, but these opportunities to make something perhaps more comfortable for a customer or create a different experience. But now we've got another problem because we've got a third thing in this world, in this interaction, and that's called the operational value stream. And so how, if we look at the SAFE construct of operational and development value streams, we've got service blueprints and journey maps. So now, how would you extend this? And we can throw in Catherine or James. How would you extend this to include the distinction between a service blueprint and, say, an operational value stream?
One piece while James and Lys are thinking about it is like we would love to see our agile release trains formed around our user journeys and or clear, distinct products. So that we can ask our experts, our cross-functional experts, to have full ownership over products or experiences. So I'm not sure if that's where you were going, and James or Lys, if you'd like to add.
Yeah, I mean so the development value stream, of course, if I'm remembering my terminology correctly, is really like how you deliver the products, the services to your trains, right? And to Catherine's point, I think we often see companies arrange those more on org structure, rather than what Catherine was just saying, which is more on the customer workflow. To me, and I always forget the name of the other one, the operational value stream, is that the right one? There's the development and operational, I think, right? Yeah. The operational one, I think, is very similar to the customer journey map and or service blueprint, but I think there's we have three different ways of describing some overlapping concepts, but we haven't maybe necessarily disambiguated that. And maybe that's an opportunity, right? Is to kind of do a little article on how they differ and how they're similar.
Yeah, I think that would be useful. I also think that when you look at the SAFE content, you'll see in the continuous delivery pipeline article, and it's definitely limited to SAFE, or limited in SAFE to things like process mapping and steps and workflows. And I do think that that's where that service blueprint comes into play, right? Because it is this diagram that lists the service delivery, the activities, but we can extend that to things like delays in our lean thinking and percent complete accurate and some of the other information that helps us design efficient systems that also serve our customers' needs. Next question.
Can I just interject really quickly? I stuck our definitions in the chat about service blueprint and customer journey map. And I'd like to say that I think one of the really nice things about both these things is that it gives you a broader viewpoint than what we usually end up with when we get into SAFe, when we get into solutions portfolios, teams, and all of the ways that we start to fracture down so we can actually perform the work. Service blueprints, customer journey maps go across these silos and allow you to think about the customer's experience holistically instead of how are we going to deliver this, who owns this part of the product, who owns these different pieces within the company, and allows you to think about it in a more customer-centric way.
Yeah, and Catherine, I think in an organization as complex and large as CVS and by closure, other larger, more complex organizations, I think it is a good goal to have arts and trains formed around solutions so that you can get this notion of a more complete ownership. But I think the reality is that I'm interacting with CVS in multiple roles and in multiple dimensions, and I'm not expecting as a consumer for CVS to have, in the Lord of the Rings, one ring to bind them all. But I am expecting that there is a certain level of consistency. So I'm going to toss this back into the world of governance. And James and Lys and Catherine are, because we've worked together, they know that I'm a big fan of governance and how governance is actually not a restrictor, but an enabler. Because if I have the right kind of governance, I can further decentralize decision-making with trust to the teams. So for you three, could you talk a little bit about the role of governance and how it's emerging as you further institutionalize design and SAFe at CVS? What kind of governances are you finding useful, and how is that being manifested?
Yeah, Catherine, I wonder if you want to start on this one. I feel like your team is doing a lot of great work in this area.
Yeah, I actually would love for to take it to the question around LPM, but James, I think that you and the design system and enablement team, from that perspective, do you want to address some guardrails, and then I can talk about perhaps.
Yeah, so I was involved in the COVID vaccine thing several years ago, and now I'm focusing more on our design system. And so, design systems are basically reusable components of code and design. It's kind of the Lego blocks essentially that build up apps and websites. And one of the things, as soon as you get anywhere close to a design system, is you realize that governance is you can't separate it from standards, right? Because you're getting into who gets to decide what the standards are, who gets input into those standards. If you don't agree on the standards, who gets to weigh in on those? And so we are actually working across multiple organizations right now. We've agreed that we want to unify our design standards. It just makes sense. Like, why rebuild things over and over again? You can save time and money and focus on more innovation. That's the easy part. I'd say that the harder part is figuring out, how do we get alignment? And, with large companies, you often have many different standards. There's a great cartoon that I'm fond of, which is two people get together and say, hey, there's 13 different standards in the world. We need to come up with the use cases so we can get to a unified standard. And then there's a few spots of time go by, and then you end up with 14 standards instead of 13, right? So it's very easy to just keep coming up with more and more standards rather than getting people aligned. But LPM is one of the things that we've been looking towards. And so we've had a lot of support. Yeah, thanks, Peter, for the cartoon. XKCD is great cartoons for UX folks. And so a lot of the ideas behind LPM have been really valuable. It's kind of making that case for why you want to get alignment at the top for certain decisions, like a design system. You could have 15 different systems if you wanted to. And so it's something I would say we're still maturing with, but we've seen a lot of interest in those concepts.
And I think that that's an important point about the role of leadership. Now, I would actually say that I don't think of LPM as being the right organizational construct to provide governance over either technical arenas, which I would more associate with the enterprise or system architect, or design arenas, which I would associate with the design team, that hierarchy that you showed in how we integrate designers and design thinking and SAFe. I want LPM to kind of support that work, but I don't want them to be doing that work. And I think that distinction is an important one. Now, in SAFe, enablers are things that create some form of a runway, and we've various kinds of architectural and technical runways. And enablers come in different sizes. They're the small enablers where, say, a development team might upgrade their testing infrastructure. There's the medium enablers where an art might decide collectively as an art to upgrade or do some kind of a technical thing. And then there's the really big enablers, which I would presume would require some form of portfolio awareness, if not approval. And that might be when you were talking about the vaccine scheduler, we really want to understand and make an investment in the complexity of the different vaccines that are coming. So, Catherine, we've got a question about how do you deal with the enablers regarding the LPM Epic flow if we're going to say that we have these enablers of the kind that we talked about. At what place does LPM get involved, and when should LPM not get involved?
So I'd like to qualify. I know that you're thinking of LPM across from its ideal state, but in our example, the way we think about the Epic workflow, something that has been really, really useful in our organization is this construct of Epic teams. Epic teams, you can think of this idea of creating cross-discipline collaboration around a product into what Lys had said, the same value that service blueprints create. Epic teams allow us to keep a radical customer centricity on a solution that might need to cross multiple trades. And so when something, because I see that Stefan had a question, when the work comes into reviewing and analyzing, we want to define the Epic hypothesis as a hypothesis and define our outcome metrics. But design might have a lot of experimentation to do in that space. And so that would be a discovery enabler. So those discovery enablers might even exist before we realize that we have an Epic. And so that can be how discovery work, experimentation, enablers, design artifacts can enable the refinement of an Epic and then connect those things together. But that doesn't mean that when the work gets to the train, that there's not still design thinking for the train to do in their local context. So to connect it back to the idea about governance, if we put a design person on each Epic team and we're building something very large, we can then take those representatives and have a governance conversation around the experience between these multiple epics and their intersection points. So that's something that the design discipline would own, architecture would own, to ensure they're taking care to ensure that the right design principles, guardrails, and design system components would be leveraged.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting answer. The curious look on my face is that you kind of threw me with the concept of an epic team. And sometimes SAFe can be criticized for, oh, I got a team for this and I got a team for that. What challenge for a large organization is an epic team solving?
So an epic team, to how Lys mentioned that we have multiple different, we can't always organize our Agile release trains around a user experience. Sometimes we have capabilities such as chat or conversational AI. Those things need to be consumed in order to create a holistic user experience. Creating an epic team is something that we've really developed that I think that meets that need for a holistic solution development that crosses multiple value streams and may need to consume multiple capabilities to deliver an end-to-end experience.
Got it. I think
And
that
we usually,
go ahead.
sorry, one more piece. We usually think of them as including the three-legged stool: design, engineering, architecture, and product. Analytics are also incredibly important, because if we're going to instrument to measure our outcomes, we want to include those folks.
Well, Stefan is continuing the conversation with us, Catherine, which is really lovely. And that they further request that, so would you pull an enabler through the LPM flow at this stage, or just do the invest in the analyze stage? And so the supposition here is that someone is using a portfolio Kanban to help them manage their portfolio flow and their portfolio epics. Do you have a construct similar to a portfolio Kanban that's helping you manage these enablers?
Yes. And in some of our spaces, we're working on it in others.
Okay,
So,
great.
to what you mentioned, Luke, you might have an enabler epic that is temporary funding in order to discover possible ideas or future opportunity. And we do encourage the idea of lean experimentation as a way to validate the hypothesis, not necessarily always building production quality software. But you're funding experimentation with the clear expectation that you are going to maybe continue the work in a new epic, or continue the investment if the hypothesis is ready to move into something that we want to build as an MVP.
Excellent. Now, what I want to field one quickly for everyone. There's a question from Peter, and he says, is the concept of intentional architecture similar to opinionated software? And Peter, I'm known for having a pretty strong cup of coffee opinion on lots of things, especially technical architecture. And I'm going to field this one with hopefully channeling a little bit of strong coffee flavor and opinion. All software is opinionated. The idea that there's this new movement of opinionated architecture or opinionated software is actually, to me, much ado about absolutely nothing. Because all things are opinionated. All tools that humans have created since humans have been creating tools have an opinion. I have an opinion of the right way to strike flint. That's why I built the tool a certain way. I have an opinion about the right way to screw a piece of wood together, which is why the screws are constructed a certain way. I have an opinion about why I should write a book in pencil versus pen, which is why pencils are made out of graphite with erasers often. So the idea of any software being not opinionated is daft, and it's just not a useful construct, because all software has an opinion. And if people say, well, you don't understand, Luke, some software has a single workflow, so it's more opinionated than software that supports multiple workflows. Well, that doesn't help us either, because then the opinion of the software is that multiple workflows are good. So all software has an opinion. All architecture has an opinion. All design has an opinion. The real question is your opinion informed by research and insight, or is it just your opinion? And there's a big difference between opinion that's informed by research and an opinion that's informed by just making it up. So James and Lys and Catherine, I'd like you to tell us a story. So I'm going to give you time to warm up in your brain about a story, because this is live, everyone. They haven't been prepared. I want you to tell us a personal story of when your activities in design caused you to change your opinion, or the opinion that was embodied in your solution.
That's a good one. I can go, well, I'm going to pull one out of the Wayback Machine, which is one of the very first products I ever designed as a designer when I really didn't know what I was doing. And I had all sorts of opinions. I was in my late 20s. I had just scored a job at a prominent local high-tech firm, or I don't know, it was high-tech, but tech firm. And, it was kind of the envy of my peers for scoring a job here. And I designed a product, and I remember myself and this amazing developer who basically thought in assembly language. He could just have an idea and just it would come out of his brain and go through his fingertips, and it would be built into the product. And we spent all this time coming up with crazier and crazier features. It's kind of like we're trying to out-geek each other, right? Like, oh, what if we did this? And it's like, oh yeah, well, if you're going to do that, why don't you do this? And the product was a $500 clock radio. And so the idea was you want to wake up to whatever music you love. This is the days of CDs. And so we're like, well, yeah, we should be able to wake up to FM, AM, or CD. This is way before all the other stuff we have these days. So then we're like, all right, well, if you're going to wake up to CD, why don't I choose a track on the CD? Because maybe I don't like track 1, it's track 2. And then it's like, well, okay, well, if I'm going to wake up to track 2, maybe the opening passage is too abrupt and you want to open to 2 minutes into track 2 of CD, blah, blah, blah. So we just kept going like this for hours. And it to this day, I have these things in my house. It does all these, our opinion was that these were amazing features. I can guarantee you no one in the world knows how to use those features. I designed them. I don't remember myself. And we did user research that showed no one ever even wanted those. And so, yeah, and to Megan's point, no one cared. And so that was a very humbling experience to me. And because this was hardware, this design is baked into these products until they die. Like this isn't like you can flash them and update them. And so that was one for me. Like, and actually I went to school for design and I had my grandfather test a usability test of this product because I didn't have any money to pay participants. And watching my poor grandfather try to figure this thing out was very humbling. It's like, okay, well, that was my opinion. And I thought it was great. And so did my engineering pal. But it turns out we never talked to our customers and they did not want that at all. So that was one of my favorite stories. So,
Lys, do you have oh, you're on mute, I think.
I know, I just got off mute. Yeah, I've got a bunch of them, but I've got one also kind of a Wayback Machine one that was one when we actually were at the point I've been doing design and research for a long time in my life. I started out in design, moved more into my passion of research in the last 10 years or so. But I was in this role where we actually were able to talk to customers. And I know that sounds shocking, but like we had all sorts of things. I worked for this agency and they started doing this big thing where we were kind of selling research as a loss leader sort of thing. I was both the researcher and the designer on it. And for me, one of my favorite things has always been disproving my own assumptions. I love that. I love going, I have this idea, and then going and taking it to a user and watching him shoot it down and tell me something better. For me, that's fantastic. And so I was working in this project where basically I can't talk exactly what it is, but it was a financing project for people that buy and sell used cars. And we had to develop a dashboard, and I had, read all the books on dashboards and, I'd done all these things, but I was able to actually go out and talk to people, and I was able to do usability on their current software that we were replacing. And I was able to talk to them about their problems and talk to them about what they were trying to accomplish and all their workarounds. And I was actually able to go back and confidently start a project for one of the first times, having talked to 20 different people who use the software daily and what their problems were. And let me tell you, designing that dashboard and redesigning that software was one of the easiest projects I'd ever had, because I knew the design objectives of what I was trying to do, because I wasn't just waiting to the end and doing usability, which is kind of like where it had been kind of previous to that, but we actually got to go out and talk to people and find out their problems first. And the other designer that kind of came along later in the project, when we were going and doing the dashboard, I'm like, no, this is what they want. This is what they need. I've got this ranked list of things that they're looking for, the stuff they need surfaced. And we were both just like, this is so freaking easy. It was so much easier to make it and took so much guesswork out. And then when I took it back out and did usability testing on it afterwards, they're like, yeah, great. You solved our problem. This is fantastic. And it was like one of the most gratifying things for me, because I know it's not exactly the question you asked, but it's one of the earliest parts of my career where we were able to talk to people before we started designing things, where we didn't just take some broken design to somebody and ask them like, hey, does this work for you? But we actually were able to find out their needs beforehand. And that was fantastic.
Heather, do you want to toss one in, or should we move on to another topic?
Should move on. Can't do better than Lys.
Well, I'm going to add one thing that I remember one of my own experiences was I had discovered design, and I used to give a talk some long time ago at conferences called GUIs with Glue: Usability Meets Agility and Creates Happier Users. And I talked about paper prototyping and simulated execution. I was actually going through some files in my attic from years ago, and I found a mouse that I used to draw on a clear cellophane, and people would move the cellophane and they'd say click to simulate clicking a button. And Mark Rettig and his work on paper prototyping was really great. But I remember one time we had built a system, and we had done all our research and we had built our story maps, and then we put it into production. And this was over at Contenio, the company I ended up selling to Scaled Agile. And people were like, this isn't working. And we're like, we did the research. We showed you the prototypes. You're supposed to act this way. And then they're like, well, yeah, but now that it's here, it's really not what we need. And what we found, and so the silver lining, and this is the final thing I think I want to bring up with everyone, is the silver lining was we had the right functionality in the wrong place. And despite what our users told us beforehand, and despite the modeling and the design during the project, it really did require the actual code that was put in place for people to click and move around and say, yes, you've got the right functionality, but it needs to move over here. Because if you put the button here, then I can do that. And we're like, oh, okay. And that acceptance, that kind of like, oh, I still did a good job, even though I didn't hit that home run. Like, Lys, you were talking about that home run. I did my work, I built the thing, and people go, yep, you solved my problem. My experience, maybe I'm not as good as you at this. My experience is we did our homework, we built the thing, and then we needed to adjust. And that's where I want to bring this home. And that is, when you're using SAFe and you're looking at your feedback, we have to remember that we're never one and done in Agile. We're never just the release and I'm not coming back. There is this notion of monitoring, and there is this notion of coming back. So in the last few moments, I'd like you all to tell us about design after done, which is you put it into production, you marked it as done, and then you have to come back to it. Tell us how that works at CVS.
It is never done. Just as a personal thing, not a CVS thing, but it is never done. You never know how it's going to react in the wild, like even your coding sort of thing. So I just want to say that, like, if you think you made a perfect thing and you released it, you never did.
Oh, you're stealing one of my favorite quotes, which is, great software is never done. It's just periodically released and updated.
Yeah. Yeah. And new needs come about. Even if you solved all the needs at that time, new things happened. COVID happened. We had to create a whole new scheduler thing.
Right. And your software changes the environment itself, right? You're releasing something that is perturbing the system. Therefore, the system has to respond, and then you have to respond once you're back in that.
And you might have one problem that was a massive problem for people, but then that just alleviates that problem for them. And then that just changes the priority of the next problems that you're dealing with, right? Yeah. And you're also having to do all sorts of other things that maybe aren't solving people's problems, and that are just business needs. And those things all exist. And I think the hardest part is that so many people have the thought that you can release it and it's done. And part of that is like the big education piece, Luke, that we did with you, with our product managers. And part of that is like really helping people understand, like, you never really solve things. You have to continually monitor, and you learn and you build and you adapt and you bring things back in. And sometimes you scrap the whole thing and start over, because what it originally was purpose built for is no longer the purpose that exists.
I love that. And that's a great closing. I want to just say, thank you from the bottom of my heart to my three friends who I admire. I've learned so much from. I hope everyone can see why they're such wonderful people in this interaction. And all of them, you've made two investments, right? Because webinars are kind of a pain, and you're taking time from your day. You've got lots of complex things going on at CVS. You're one of the world's most important companies, and you know that, and you take that responsibility. So I just want to say thank you for you three, and thank you for your openness and your willingness to share what's working and tackle these problems as a group.
Thank you, Luke.
Thanks for giving us the opportunity. I mean, we geek out on this stuff anyways, right? So whether it's the three of us hanging out over a Zoom meeting or talking to people online outside of it, and it's awesome to hear the questions, and we'd love to hear from folks. You know, if you've had similar, different experiences, we're still evolving this ourselves, and yeah. So thanks so much.
Yeah.
All right. I actually wish that we could just spend the rest of the day, right? I think the preference would be now let's, go to the pub. But
Right.
It's 9 a.m. in California where I'm sitting. So I'm not allowed to go to the pub yet. So I'm
We're
going to get
across the US. So
yeah, well, we don't judge.
If you go I mean, if you go globally, it's 5 o'clock somewhere, right? That's always the saying. So, right.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you. Yeah, where Klaus is, I think it is time for a pub. But
go visit.
everyone, thank you so much, and for everyone, let us know if this format was enjoyable, because the CVS team writ large is doing extraordinary work in Agile. They're doing extraordinary work in design. They're doing extraordinary technical work too. I don't want to discount some of the powerful and useful technical innovations that are going on there. So Peter, Peter, as my kids would say, Peter is flexing right now. So Peter, you flex, go get a beer, and all of us will say thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.